Chapter 11. Espionage at Close Range. Cashing a modest cheque at the Colonial Bank one morning, Trent had fallen in line with a queue at the paying teller's window. He made it a point to observe what went on while he waited. He was not much interested in bank robberies. To begin with, the American Bankers' Association is a vengeful society pursuing to the death such as mulct its clients. Furthermore, a successful bank robbery, unless the work of an inside man, needs careful planning and collaboration. On this particular morning Trent saw a stout and jocund gentleman push his cheque across the glass entrance to the cashier's cave and receive without hesitation a large sum of money. He passed the time of day with the official, climbed into a limousine and was whirled up Broadway. "Did you see that?" a youth demanded who stood before Trent. "What?" he asked quietly. It was not his pose to be interested in other of the bank's customers. "That guy took out $20,000, the boy said, reverence in his tone. "That's a lot of money," said Trent. "He lives well," said the lad. "I ought to know. He gets his groceries from us and he only eats and drinks the best." "He looks like it," the other said genially. If the stout and jocund gourmet had known what was in Trent's mind he would have hied him back to the bank and redeposited his cash. "It's Rudolph Lieberman, isn't it?" "That's Frederick Williams, and he lives on 93rd near the Drive." What additional information Trent wanted to know might be obtained from other than this boy. To make many inquiries might, if Frederick Williams were relieved of his role, bring back the incident to the grocer's boy. Directly dusk fell, Anthony Trent, in the evening garb of fashion, crossed over to Riverside Drive and presently came to the heroic statue of Jeanne d'Arc, which stands at the foot of 93rd Street. By this time he knew the license number of the Williams limousine and the address. It was one of those small residences of grey stone containing a dozen rooms or so. Such houses, as he knew, were usually laid out on a similar plan and he was familiar with it. It was very rarely that he made a professional visit to a house without having a definite plan of attack carefully worked out. This was the first time he sought to gain entrance to a strange house on the mere chance of success. But the $20,000 in crisp notes tempted him. In his last affair he had netted the sum in notes of a similar denomination and he was superstitious enough to feel that this augured well for tonight's success. Careful as ever, Trent had made his alibis in case of failure. In one of his pockets was a pint flask of bourbon, empty save for a dram of spirit. In another was a slip of paper containing the name of the householder who occupied a house with the same number as that of Williams but on 95th Street. Once before he had saved himself by this ruse. He had protested vigorously when detected by a footman that he was merely playing a practical joke on his old college chum who lived, as he thought, in this particular house, but was found to be on the next block. And in this case the emptied whiskey flask and the cheerful tipsiness of the amiable young man of fashion, Trent's most successful pose, saved him. In his pockets nothing would be found to incriminate him. He knew well the folly of carrying the automatic so beloved of screen or stage raffles. In the first place, the sudden temptation to murder in a tight pinch, and in the second, the Sullivan law. In the bamboo cane, carefully concealed, were slender rods of steel whose presence few would suspect. He had left such a cane in Senator Scrivener's Fifth Avenue mansion when he was compelled to make an unrehearsed exit. Once he met the senator coming down the steps of the Union Club with this cane in his hand. He chuckled to think what might be that worthy's chagrin to know he had been carrying burglar's tools with him. As there was little light on the lower floor of Frederick Williams' house, Trent let himself in cautiously. There was a dim hanging light which showed that the Williams idea of furnishing was in massive bad taste. At the rear of the hall were the kitchens. Under the swinging door he could see a bright light. The stairs were wide and did not creak. Carefully he ascended them and stood breathless in a foyer between the two main reception rooms. There were voices in the rear room, which should, if Williams conformed to the majority of dwellers in such houses, be the dining room. Big doors shut out view and sound until he crept nearer and peeped through a keyhole. He could see Williams sitting in a Turkish rocker smoking a cigar. There were two other men and all three chatted volubly in German. Unfortunately it was a tongue of which the listener knew almost nothing. Reasonably fluent in French, the comprehension of German was beyond him. There was a small safe in the corner and it was not closed. Trent felt certain that in it reposed those notes he had come for. In the corner of the foyer was a carven teakwood table with a glass top, and on it was a large Boston fern. It would be easy enough to crouch there unobserved. The only possibility of discovery was the remote contingency that Williams and his friends might choose to use this foyer. But Trent had seen that it was not furnished as a sitting room. He had barely determined on his hiding place when he found the sudden necessity to use it. Williams arose quickly and advanced to the door. When he threw it open, the path of light left the unbidden one completely obscured. The three men passed by him and entered the drawing room in front. Trent caught a view of a luxuriously over-furnished room and a grand piano. Then Williams began to play a part of a Brahms sonata so well that Trent's heart warmed toward him. But his appreciation of the master did not permit him to listen to the whole movement. He crept cautiously from his cover and into the room the three had just vacated. If there were other of William's friends or family here, Trent might be called upon to exercise his undoubted talents. One man he would not hesitate to attack, since his working knowledge of jiu-jitsu was beyond the average. If there were two, attack would be useless in the absence of a revolver. But if the coast were clear, then a competence, all the golf and fishing he desired. There would be only the Countess to deal with at his leisure. The room was empty, but the safe was closed. Williams was not devoid of caution. A glance at the thing showed Trent that in an uninterrupted half-hour he could learn its secrets, but he could hardly be assured of that at 9 o'clock at night. His very presence in the room was fraught with danger. The one door leading from it opened into a butler's pantry from which a flight of stairs led into the kitchen part of the house. Downstairs he could hear faucets running. A dumb waiter offered a way of escape if he were put to it. To the side of the dumb waiter was a zinc-lined compartment used for drying dishes. It was 4 feet long and 3 in height, and a shelf bisected it. This he took out carefully and placed upon the floor of the compartment, making an ample space for concealment. A radiator opened into it, giving the heat desired, and 2 iron gratings in the doors afforded Trent the opportunity to overhear what might be said. He satisfied himself that the doors opened noiselessly. The burglar's role was not always an heroic one, he told himself, and thought of the popular misconception of such activities. It must have been an hour later when he heard sounds in the adjoining room. By this time he was fighting against the drowsiness induced by the heat of his prison. The swinging door between the butler's pantry and the dining room was thrown open, and Williams came in. He leaned over the staircase and shouted something in German to someone in the kitchen, who answered him in the same tongue. There was the sound below of locking and bolting the doors. The servants had evidently been sent to bed. When Williams went back to the other room, the door between did not swing to by 4 or 5 inches. So far as Williams was concerned, this carelessness was to cost him more than he guessed. Even in his hiding place the conversation was audible to Trent, although its meaning was incomprehensible. He was suddenly awakened to a more vivid interest when he became aware that it was now English that they were talking. There was a newcomer in the room, a man with a nasal carrying voice and prodigious brogue. "This gentleman," he heard Williams say, "is Mr. O'Sheill, who has done so much good work for us and for the freedom of oppressed, starving, shackled Ireland, which we shall free. I may tell Mr. O'Sheill that the highest personages in the fatherland weep bitter tears for Ireland's wrongs." "That's all right," said the Sinn Feiner, a trifle ungraciously. "But what's behind yonder door?" For answer one of the other men flung it open, turned up the lights and permitted Mr. O'Sheill to make his examination. Trent heard the man's heavy tread as he descended the stairway and found at the bottom a locked door. "You've got to be careful," O'Sheill said when he rejoined Williams and the rest. "These damn Secret Service men are everywhere, they tell me." "That is why we have rented a private house," one of the Germans declared. "At a hotel privacy is impossible. We've had our experiences." These scraps of conversation aroused Anthony Trent immediately. It required only a cursory knowledge of the affairs of the moment for a duller man than he to realize that he had come across the scent of one of those plots which were so hampering his government in their prosecution of the war. Very cautiously he crawled from his hiding place and made his silent way to the barely opened door. O'Sheill was lighting a large cigar. His was a suspicious, dour face. Williams, urbane and florid, was very patient. "That I do not tell you the names of my colleagues," he said, "is of no moment. It is sufficient to say that you have the honor to be in the presence of one of the most illustrious personages in my country." Here he bowed in the direction of a small, thin, dapper man who did not return the salutation. "I came for the money," said O'Sheill. "You came first for your instructions," snapped the illustrious personage coldly. "That's so, your honor," O'Sheill answered. There was something menacing in the tone of the other man and he recognized it. "This money," said Williams, "is given for very definite purposes and an accounting will be demanded." "Ain't you satisfied with the way I managed it at Cork?" O'Sheill demanded. "It was a beginning," Williams conceded. "Here is what you must do. Wherever along the Irish coast the English bluejackets and the American sailors foregather, you must stir up bad blood. I do not pretend to give you any more precise direction than this. Let the Americans understand that the British call them cowards. Let the British think the same of the Yankees. Let there be bitter street fights, not in obscure drinking dens, but in the public streets in the light of day. I will see to it that the news gets back here and let Americans have something to think about when the next draft is raised. Find men in England to do what you must do in your own country. Let there be black blood between Briton and American from Belfast to Portsmouth. Let there be doubt and recrimination so that preparations are hindered here." The man who passed as Williams looked venomous as he said this. The man to whom he spoke, thinking in his ignorance that he was indeed helping his native land instead of hurting it, and forgetful that in aiding the enemies of America he was stabbing a country which had ever been a faithful friend of Erin's, gave particulars of his operations, which Trent memorized as best he might. He was appalled to hear to what length these men were prepared to go, if only the good relations between the allies might be brought to naught. So engrossed was he with the importance of what he heard that the passing of the large sum of money from Williams to the Sinn Feiner lost much of its entrancing interest. Trent meant to have the money, but he intended also to give the Department of Justice what help he could. It was not the first time that he had gone from one floor to another by means of a dumb waiter. It was never an easy operation and rarely a noiseless one. In this instance he was fortunate in finding well-oiled pulleys. It was only when he stepped out in the kitchen that he ran into danger. There was a man asleep on a folding bed which had been drawn across the door. To leave by the front door immediately was imperative. Even were it possible to leave by a rear entrance, he would find himself in the little garden at the back and could only get out by climbing a dozen fences. This would be to court observation and run unnecessary risks. To invite electrocution by killing men was no part of Anthony Trent's practice. It was plain that the servant was slumbering fitfully and the act of stepping over him to freedom likely to awaken him instantly. Even if he had the needed rope at hand, binding and gagging a vigorous man was at best a matter of noise and struggle. But something had to be done. He must reach the street in time to follow O'Sheill. Superimposed on the bed's frame was a mattress and army blanket. Directly behind the sleeper's head was a door which led, as Trent knew from his knowledge of house design, to the cellar. It opened inward and without noise. He bent quietly over the man, put his hands gently beneath the mattress and then with a tremendous effort flung him, mattress, army blanket and all, down the cellar stairs. There was a clatter of breaking bottles, a cry that died away almost as it was uttered, and then the door was shut on silence. A little later Williams, feeling the need for iced beer and cheese sandwiches, rang the bell for Fritz. When he received no answer he descended to the kitchen with the intention of buffeting. Chapter 12. The Sinn Fein Plot. Fortunately for O'Sheill's peace of mind, he left the house before Williams made his discovery. He stepped into the street painfully conscious of the large sum of money he carried. It seemed to him that every man looked at him suspiciously. A request for a match was met with an oath, and the two women who asked him the location of a certain hotel drew back nervously at his scowl. He boarded the elevated at the 93rd Street station and alighted at 9th Avenue and 42nd Street, still glancing about him suspiciously. It was not until he was in his room on the top floor of a cheap and old hotel on the far west side that he ventured to feel safe. He sighed with relief as he stuffed a Dublin clay with malodorous shag. $20,000. £4,000. Some would go to the traitorous work he was employed to prosecute, but a lot of it would go to satisfy private hates. And when it was exhausted there would be more to come. It would be easy to conceal the notes about his person, and anyway, he reflected, he was not under suspicion. He was aroused from his reveries by the sudden gentle tapping on his door. After a few seconds of hesitation he called out, "What is it you want?" The voice that answered him was strongly tinged with a German accent to which he had recently become used. It will not be forgotten that Anthony Trent had a genius for mimicry. "I'm from Mr. Williams," said the stranger gutturally. He had followed O'Sheill with no difficulty. "What's your name?" O'Sheill demanded. "We won't give names," Trent reminded him significantly. "But I can prove my identity. I was in the house at 93rd Street when you came. The money was given you to stir up trouble in Ireland and circulate rumors that will embarrass the British government and make bad blood between English and American sailors. You have 20 $1,000 bills and you put them in a green oilskin package." "That's right," O'Sheill admitted. "But what do you want?" He was filled with a vague uneasiness. This young man seemed so terribly in earnest and his eyes darted from door to window and window to door as though he feared interruption. "Mr. Williams sent me here to see if you had been followed. Directly you went we had information from an agent of ours that your visit was known to the Secret Service. Tell me, did any person speak to you on your way here?" "No," answered O'Sheill, now thoroughly nervous by the other's anxiety. "Are you sure?" he was asked. "There was one fellow who asked me for a light, but I told him to go to hell and get it." "Anything suspicious about him?" Trent demanded. "Not that I could see." "That will be good news for Mr. Williams," Trent returned. "Our agent said the hunchback was on the job." "Who's he?" O'Sheill said. "One of our most dangerous enemies," the younger man retorted. "He's a man of 40 but looks younger. He had one shoulder higher than the other and he limps when he walks. He's the man we're afraid of. I think we have alarmed ourselves unnecessarily." O'Sheill's face was no longer merely uneasy. He was terror stricken. "And I guess we haven't," he exclaimed. "The man who asked me for a light was a hunchback. There was 2 women who asked me the way to some blasted hotel. They looked at me as if they wanted never to forget my face." "Stop a minute," said Trent gravely. "Answer me exactly about these women. I want to know in what danger we all stand. The only 2 women known by sight to us who are likely to be put on a case of this kind wouldn't look like detectives. There's Mrs. Daniels and Miss Barrett. They work as mother and daughter. Mrs. Daniels is gray haired, tall and slight, with a big nose for a woman and eyes set close together. When she looks at you it seems as if the eyes were gimlets. The girl is pretty, reddish hair and laughing eyes." Trent paused for a moment to think of any other attributes he could ascribe to the unknown women he had directed to their hotel just after O'Sheill had scowled at them a half hour back. "And very white little teeth." "My God!" cried O'Sheill, his arms dropping at his side. "That's them to the life. What's going to happen to me?" "If they find you with that money you'll be deported and handed over to your British friends. How can you explain having $20,000? Mr. Williams thought of that but he didn't actually know they were on your trail. You must give me the money. I shan't be stopped. You are to stay here. They may be here in 5 minutes or they may wait till morning, but you may be certain that you won't be allowed to get away. You must claim to be just over here to get an insight into labor conditions." Mr. Williams' messenger chuckled. "I don't believe they can get anything on you." "But if they do?" O'Sheill demanded. It seemed to him that the stranger's levity was singularly ill-timed. "If they do," Trent advised, "you must remember that you're a British subject still, whether you like it or not, and you have certain inalienable rights. Immediately appeal to the British authorities. Give the Earl of Reading some work to do. Make the Consul General here stir himself. Tell them you came over here to investigate labor conditions. That story goes any time and just now it's fashionable. As an Irishman you will have far more consideration from the British government than if you were merely an Englishman." "But what about this money?" O'Sheill queried uneasily. "I'll take it," Trent told him. "If it's found on you nothing can do you any good. You'll do your plotting in a British jail." O'Sheill was amazed at the careless manner in which this large sum was thrust into the other man's pocket. Surely these accomplices of his dealt in big things. "When you're ready to sail you can get it back," Trent continued. "That can be arranged later. Meanwhile don't forget my instructions. Be indignant when you are searched. Call on the British ambassador." Trent paused suddenly. An idea had struck him. "By the way," he went on, "you have other things that would get you into trouble beside that money." "I know it," O'Sheill admitted. "What am I to do with them?" "I'm taking a chance if they're found on me," the younger man commented. "But they are not after me. Give me what you have," he cried. Into this keeping the frightened O'Sheill confided certain letters which later were to prove such an admirable aid to the United States government. It was as Trent turned to the door that he heard steps coming along the passage as softly as the creaking boards permitted. He placed his fingers on his lips and enjoined silence. The furtive sound completed O'Sheill's distress. He felt himself entrapped. Trent saw him take from his hip pocket a revolver. "Not yet," he whispered. "Wait." He turned down the gas to a tiny glimmer. Through the transom the stronger light in the passage was seen. It was but a slight effort for the muscular Trent to draw himself up so that he could peer through the transom at the man tapping softly at the door. Unquestionably it was Williams, and the hand concealed in his right-hand coat pocket was no doubt gripping the butt of an automatic. He was a man of great physical strength. That Trent had noted earlier in the evening. Although of enormous strength himself and a boxer and wrestler he knew he would stand no chance if these two discovered his errand. There was no other exit than the door. Anthony Trent stepped silently to O'Sheill's side. "It's the hunchback," he whispered. "If once he gets those long fingers around your throat you're gone. Listen to me. I'm going to turn the gas out. Then I shall open the door. When he rushes in, get him. If he gets you instead, I'll be on the top of him and we'll tie him up. Ready?" The prospect of a fight restored O'Sheill's spirits. Every line of his evil face was a black menace to Friedrich Wilhelm outside. "Don't use your revolver," Anthony Trent cautioned. "Why?" O'Sheill whispered. "We can't stand police investigation," said the other. "Get ready now. I'm going to open the door." When he flung it open Williams stepped quickly in. O'Sheill, maddened at the very thought that anyone imperiled his money, could only see in the dim light an enemy. The first blow he struck landed fair and square on the Prussian nose. On his part Williams supposed the attack a premeditated one. O'Sheill was playing him false. The pain of the blow awoke his own hot temper and made him killing mad. He sought to get his strong arms about the Sinn Feiner's throat. It was while they thrashed about on the floor that Anthony Trent made his escape. He closed the door of the room carefully and locked it from the outside. Then he unscrewed the electric bulb that lit the hall. None saw him pass into the street. It was one of his triumphant nights. Next morning at breakfast he found Mrs. Kinney much interested in the city's police news as set forth in the papers. He was singularly cheerful. "What is it?" he demanded. "Some very dreadful crime?" "A double murder," she told him, "and the police don't seem to be able to figure it out at all." Trent sipped his coffee gratefully. "What's strange about that?" he demanded. "I don't see," Mrs. Kinney went on, "what a gentleman like this Mr. Williams seems to have been—" Anthony Trent put down his cup. "What's his other name?" he inquired. "Frederick," said the interested Mrs. Kinney. "Frederick Williams, a Holland Dutch gentleman living in 93rd Street near the Drive. He aided the Red Cross and bought Liberty Bonds. What I want to know is why he went to a low place like the Shipwrights Hotel to see a man named O'Sheill from Liverpool, England." "A double murder?" he demanded. "Here it is," she returned, and showed him the paper. The two men had been found dead, the report ran, under mysterious circumstances, but the police thought a solution would quickly be found. Anthony Trent smiled as he read of official optimism. He was inclined to doubt it. When Mrs. Kinney was out shopping he read through the documents he had taken from O'Sheill. They seemed to him to be of prime importance. There was a list of American Sinn Feiners implicating men in high positions, men against whom so far nothing detrimental was known. Outlines of plots were made bare to embroil and antagonize Britain and the United States, allies in the great cause, and all that subtle propaganda which had nothing to do with the betterment of prosperous Ireland, but everything to do with Prussian aggrandizement. It was a poisonous collection of documents. The chief of the Department of Justice in New York was called up from a public station and informed that a messenger was on his way with very important papers. The chief was warned to make immediate search of the premises at 93rd Street, where a highly important German spy might be captured. In the evening papers Anthony Trent was gratified to learn that the highly born, thin, haughty person was Chapter 13. Anthony Trent interests himself in police gossip. So far as he knew, none suspected him. His face had been seen on one or two occasions, but he was of a type common among young Americans of the educated classes. Above middle height, slenderly fashioned but wire strong, he had a shrewd, humorous face with strongly marked features. It might be that the nose was a trifle large and the mouth a trifle tight, but none looking at him would say, "There goes a criminal." They would say rather, "There goes a resourceful young businessman who can rise to any emergency." Since Trent had calculated everything to a nicety, he knew he must, during these harvesting years, deny himself the privilege of friendship with other men or women. Too many of his guild had lost their liberty through some errant desire to be confidential. This habit of solitude was trying to a man naturally of a sociable nature, but he determined that it could be cast from him as one throws away an old coat when he was a burglar emeritus. That blessed moment had arrived. He even looked up an old editor friend, the man who had first put into his mind that he could make more money at burglary than in writing fiction. "It's good to see you again," cried the editor. "I often wish you hadn't been left money by that Australian uncle of yours. so that you could still write those corking crook yarns for us. There was never anyone like you. I was talking about you at the Scribblers Club dinner the other night." Trent frowned. Publicity was a thing to avoid, and this particular editor had always been ready to sound his praise. The editor had once before asked him to join this little club made up of professional writers. They were men he would have delighted to know under other conditions. "Be my guest next Tuesday," the editor persisted. "I'm toastmaster and the subject is Crime in Fiction. I told the boys I'd get you to speak if I possibly could. I'm counting on you. Will you do it?" It seemed a deliciously ironical thing. Here was an honest editor asking the friend he did not know to be a master criminal to make an address on crime in fiction. Trent laughed the noiseless laugh he had cultivated in place of the one that was in reality the expression of himself. The editor thought it a good sign. "Who are the other speakers?" Trent demanded. "Oppenheim Phelps for one. He's over here on a visit. His speciality is high-grade international spy stuff, as you know. E.W. Hornung would be the man to have if we could get him, but that's impossible. I've got half a dozen others, but Phelps and you will be the drawing cards." "Put me down," Trent said genially, "but introduce me as a back number almost out of touch with things but willing to oblige a pal." He laughed again, his noiseless laugh. Crosbeigh looked at him meditatively. Certainly Anthony Trent was changed. In the old days, before he came into Australian money, he was at times jocund with a fruitful grape, a good fellow, a raconteur, one who had been popular at school and college and liked to stand well with his fellows. But now, Crosbeigh reflected, he was changed. There was a certain suspicion about him, a lack of trust in men's motives. It was the attitude, no doubt, which wealth brought. The moneyless man can meet a borrower cheerfully and need cudgel his mind for no other excuse than his poverty. Crosbeigh was certain Trent had a lot of money for the reason he had actually refused 4 cents a word for what he had previously received only 2 cents. But the editor admired his old contributor and was glad to see him again. "I'm going to spring a surprise on you," Crosbeigh declared, "and I'm willing to bet you'll enjoy it." "I hope so," Trent returned idly and little dreamed what lay before him. The dinner was at a chop house and the food no worse than the run of city restaurants. Anthony Trent, who had fared delicately for some time, put up with the viands readily enough for the pleasure of being again among men of the craft which had been his own. Oppenheim Phelps was interesting. He was introduced as a historian who had made his name at fiction. It was a satisfaction, he said, to find that modern events had justified him. The reviewers had formerly treated him with patronizing airs. They had called his secret diplomacy and German plot stuff as chimeras only when they had shown themselves to be transcripts, and not exaggerated ones at that, of what had taken place during the last few years. Anthony Trent sat next to the English novelist and liked him. It brought him close to the war to talk to a man whose home had been bombed from air and submarine. And Phelps was also a golfer and asked Trent, when the war was over, to visit his own beloved links at Cromer. It had grown so late when the particularly prosy member of the club had made his yawn-bringing speech that Crosbeigh came apologetically to Trent's side. "I'm afraid, old man," he began, "that it's too late for any more speeches except the surprise one. A lot of us commute. Do you mind speaking at our next meeting instead?" "Not a bit," Trent said cheerfully. But he felt, as all speakers do under these circumstances, that his speech would have been a brilliant one. He had coined a number of epigrams as other speakers had ploughed laboriously along their lingual way, and now they were to be stillborn. But he soon forgot them when Crosbeigh announced the surprise speaker. "I've been very fortunate," Crosbeigh began, "in getting tonight a man who knows more of the ways of crooks than any living authority. Gentlemen, you all know Inspector McWalsh." "Well, boys," said the inspector, "I guess a good many of you know me by name." He had risen to his full height and looked about him genially. He had imbibed just the right amount to bring him to this stage. 3 highballs later he would be looking for insults, but he was now ripe with good humor. He had come because Conington Warren had asked him to oblige Crosbeigh. For writers on crime he had the usual contempt of the professional policeman, and he was fluent in his denunciation. "You boys," he went on, "make me smile with your modern scientific criminals, the guys what use chemistry and electricity and X-rays and so forth. I've been a policeman now for 30 years and I never run across any of that stuff yet." Inspector McWalsh poured his unsubtle scorn on such writings for 10 full minutes, but he added nothing to the scribbler's knowledge of his subject. It chanced that the writer he had taken as his victim was a guest at the dinner. This fictioneer pursued the latest writings on physicist and chemical research so that he might embroider his tales therewith. Personally, Trent was bored by this artificial type of story. But as between writer and policeman, he was always for the writer. The writer was plainly angry, but the gods had not blessed him with a ready tongue, and he was prepared to sit silent under McWalsh's scorn. Some mischievous devil prompted Anthony Trent to rise to his aid. It was a bold thing to do, to draw the attention of the man who had been in charge of the detectives sent to run him to earth, but of late excitement had been lacking. "Inspector McWalsh," he commenced, "possesses precisely that type of mind one would expect to find in a successful policeman. He has that absolute absence of imagination without which one cannot attain his rank in the force. All he has done in his speech is to pour his scorn of a certain type of crime story on its author. As writers we are sorry if Inspector McWalsh never heard of the Eindhoven string galvanometer upon which the solution of the story he ridicules rests, yet we know it to exist. Were I a criminal instead of a writer, I should enjoy to cross swords with men who think as the inspector does. I could outguess them every time." "Who is this guy?" Inspector McWalsh demanded loudly. "Anthony Trent," Mr. Crosbeigh whispered. "He wrote some wonderful crook stories a few years ago dealing with a crook called Conway Parker." "What one would expect to hear from a man with McWalsh's opportunities to deal with crime is some of the difficulty he experiences in his work. There must be difficulty. We know by statistics what crimes are committed and what criminals brought to justice. What happens to the crooks who remain safe from arrest by reason of superior skill? I'll tell you, gentlemen. They live well and snap their fingers at men like the last speaker. There is such a thing as fatty degeneration of the brain." Inspector McWalsh rose to his feet with a roar. "I didn't come here to be insulted." "I'm not insulting a guest," Trent went on equably. "I'm asking him to tell us interesting things of his professional work instead of giving his opinion on modern science. I met McWalsh years ago when I covered Mulberry Street for the Morning Leader. He was captain then. Let him entertain us with some of the reasons why the Ashy Bennet murderer was never caught. You remember, gentlemen, that Bennet was shot down on Park Row at midday. Then the thoroughbred racer Foxkeen was poisoned in his stall at Sheepshead Bay. Why was that crime never punished? I remember a dozen others where the police have been beaten. Coming down to the present time, there's the robbery of the house of the genial sportsman Inspector McWalsh tells us he is proud to call his friend, Conington Warren. How was it the burglar or burglars were allowed to escape?" Trent was enjoying himself hugely. "I have a right to demand protection of the New York police. In my own humble home I have valuables bequeathed me by an uncle in Australia, which are never safe while such men as snap their fingers at the police are at large. Let Inspector McWalsh tell us why his men fail. It will help us, perhaps, to understand the difficulties under which they labor. It may help us to appreciate the silent, unadvertised work of the police. The inspector is a good sport, who loves a racehorse and a good glove fight as much as I do myself. I assure him he will make us grateful if we will take the hint of a humble scribbler." The applause which followed gratified the inspector enormously. He thought it was evidence of his popularity, a tribute to his known fondness for the race tracks. His anger melted. "Boys," he shouted, rising to his feet and waving a Laranaga to the applauders, "I guess he's right, and I hope the fellow who writes that scientific dope will accept my word that it wasn't personal. Of course we do have difficulties. I admit it. I had charge of that Ashy Bennet murder, and I'd give $1,000 to be able to put my hand on the man who done it. As to Foxkeen, I had 1,000 on him to win at 8-1, and when he was poisoned the odds were shortening every minute, so you can guess I was sore on the skunk who poisoned him. The police of all countries fail, and they fail the most in countries where people have most sympathy with crime. Boys, you know you all like a clever crook to get away with it. It's human nature. We ain't helped all we could be, and you know it. We gentlemen of the police," he quoted Austin's words glibly, "we make mistakes sometimes. We get the ordinary crooks easy enough. If you don't believe me, get a permit to look over Sing Sing. The crimes the last speaker mentioned were committed by clever men. They get away with it. The clever ones do get away with things for a bit. But if the guy who croaked Bennett tried murder again, the odds are we'd gather him in. Same with the man or men who put strychnine in Foxkeen's oats. The clever ones get careless. That's our opportunity." The inspector lighted a new cigar, sipped his highball and came back to his speech. "Boys, I'm not rich, no honest cop is, but I'd give a lot of money to get my hands on a gentleman crook who's operating right now in this city. I've got a list of 7 tricks I'm certain he done him." Chapter 14. Ambulances and Diamonds. There was an opportunity later on to visit the Scribblers again. Crosbeigh begged him to come as he desired a full attendance in honor of an occasion unique in the club's history. It seemed that some soldier members of the club, foregathering in New York, offered the opportunity for a meeting that might never recur. The toastmaster was a former officer, and the speakers were men who had fought through the ghastly early years of the war before the United States came into it. It happened that Trent had known the toastmaster, Captain Alan Kent, when the two had been newspaper cubs together. In those days Kent had been an irresponsible, happy-go-lucky youngster, liked by all for his carefree disposition. Today, after 3 years of war, he was a sterner man, in whose eyes shone steadily the conviction of the cause he had espoused. War had purged the dross from him. "You boys here," he said, "haven't suffered enough. You haven't seen nations in agony as we have. The theatre of war is still too remote. The loss of a transport wakens you to renewed effort for a moment, and then you get back to thinking of other things, more agreeable things, and speculate as to when the war will be over. I've spoken to rich men who seem to think they've done all that is required of them by purchasing a few Liberty bonds. They must be bought if we're to win the war, but there's little of the personal element of sacrifice in merely buying interest-bearing bonds." He launched into a description of war as he had seen it, dwelling on the character it developed rather than the horrors he had suffered, horrors such as are depicted in the widely circulated book of Henry Barbusse. This mention of negative patriotism rather disturbed Anthony Trent. All he had done was to buy Liberty bonds, and here was Alan Kent who had lived through 3 years of hell to come back full of courage and cheer, and anxious, when his health was re-established, to leave the British service and enroll in the armies of America. It was not agreeable for him to think how he had passed those 3 years. He was awakened from these unpleasant thoughts by the applause which followed Kent's speech. The next speaker was an ambulance driver who made a plea for more and yet more ambulances. "Lots of you people here," he said, "seem to think that when once a battery of ambulances are donated, they are there till the war is over. They suffer as much as guns or horses. The Huns get special marks over there for potting an ambulance, and they're getting to be experts at the game. I've had 3 of Henry Ford's little masterpieces shot under me, so to speak. I'm trying to interest individuals in giving ambulances. They're not very expensive. You can equip one for $5,000. Men have said to me, 'What's the use of one ambulance?' I tell them, as I tell you, that the one they may send will do its work before it's knocked out. It may pick up a brother or pal of a man in this room. It may pick up some of you boys even, for some of you are going. God, it makes me tired, this cry of 'what's the use of one little ambulance?'" When the dinner was over, Trent renewed his acquaintance with Captain Kent and was introduced to Lincoln, the Harvardian driver of an ambulance. Over coffee in the Pirates' Den, Lincoln told them more of his work. "This afternoon," he said, "I had tea with the Baroness von Eckstein. You know who she is?" Trent nodded. The Baroness was the enormously wealthy widow of a St. Louis brewer who had married a Westphalian noble and hoped thereby to get into New York and Washington society. The Baron had been willing to sell his title, not an old one, for all the comforts of a wealthy home. He had become naturalized and was not suspected by the Department of Justice of treachery. His one ambition seemed to be to drink himself to death on the best cognac that could be obtained. This potent brew, taken half and half with champagne, seemed likely to do its work. It was rumored that his wife did not hinder him in this interesting pursuit. "I sat behind him at a theatre once," Trent admitted. "He's a thin little man with an enormous head and a strong Prussian accent." He resisted the temptation to mimic the Baron, as he could have done. He could not readily banish his professional caution. "I tried to get the Baroness to buy and equip 4 ambulances," Lincoln went on. "It would only have cost her $20,000, nothing to her, but she refused." "Before we went into the war," Captain Kent reminded him, "she was strongly pro-German." "She's had enough sense to stop that talk in New York," Lincoln went on. "She's still trying to break into the 400. You've got to be loyal to your country for that, thank God." "I thought she was in St. Louis," Trent observed. "She's taken a house in town," Lincoln told him. "The Burton Trent mansion on Washington Square North. Took it furnished for 3 months. She had to pay like the deuce for the privilege. Gotham Gossip unkindly remarks that she did it so some of the Burton Trents' friends may call on her, thinking they are visiting the Trents. It's the nearest she'll ever get to high society. It made me sick to hear her hard luck story. Couldn't give me a measly $20,000 because of income tax and high cost of living and all that sort of bunk, while she had $100,000 in diamonds on her fat neck. I felt like pulling them off her." Anthony Trent pricked up his ears at this. "I didn't know she had a necklace of that value," he mused. "I guess you don't know much about the fortunes these millionaire women hang all over them," said Lincoln. Lincoln had an idea the other man was a bookish scholar, a collector of rare editions, one removed from knowledge of society life. "That must be it," Trent agreed. He wondered if another man in all America had so intimate a knowledge of the disposition of famous gems. "So she won't give you any money for ambulances?" "It's known she subscribed largely to the German Red Cross before we got into the war. Labbats don't change their spots easily, as you know. It was one of her chauffeurs at her country place near Roslyn who rigged up a wireless and didn't know he was doing anything the government disapproved of. His mistress lent him the money to equip the thing and she didn't know she ought not to have done it. I tell you, I felt like pulling that necklace off her fat old neck. Wouldn't you feel that way?" "It might make me," Trent admitted, "a little envious." On the whole, Trent enjoyed his first evening of emancipation immensely. Particularly glad was he to meet his old friend Alan Kent again. The repressed life he had led made him more than ever susceptible to the hearty friendship of such men as he had met. With some of them he made arrangements to go to a costume dance, a Greenwich Village festival at Webster Hall on the following evening. He did not know that Captain Kent was attending less as one who would enjoy the function socially than an emissary of his government. It was known that many of the villagers had not registered. Some had spoken openly against the draft and others were suspected of pro-German tendencies that might be dangerous. It was not a commission Kent cared about, but it was a time in the national history where old friendships must count for naught. Treason must be stamped out. It was not until midnight that Trent dropped into Webster Hall. It was the nearest approach to the boulevard dances that New York ever saw. The costumes were gorgeous, some of them, but for the greater part quaint and bizarre. As a Pierrot he was inconspicuous. There were a number of men he knew from the Scribblers' Club. He greeted Lincoln with enthusiasm. He liked the lad. He envied him his record. It was while he was talking to him that a gorgeously dressed woman seized Lincoln's hands as one might grasp those of an old and dear friend. "Naughty boy," she said playfully. "Why haven't you asked me to dance?" "I feared I wasn't good enough for you," Lincoln lied with affable readiness. "You dance like a professional." While this badinage went on Trent gazed at the woman with idle curiosity. Her enameled face, penciled eyebrows and generally careful make-up made her look no more than 45. Her hair was henna colored with purple depths in it. She was too heavy for her height and her eyes were bright with the light that comes in cocktail glasses. She had reached the fan-tapping, coquettish, slightly amorous stage. Her bold eyes soon fell on Anthony Trent, who was a far more personable man than Lincoln. "Who's your good-looking friend?" she demanded. Lincoln was bound to make the introduction. From his manner Trent imagined he was not over-pleased at having to do so. "Mr. Anthony Trent, the Baroness von Eckstein," he said. The Baroness instantly put her bejeweled hand within Trent's arm. "I'm sure you dance divinely," she cooed. Lincoln was a little disappointed at the readiness with which the older man answered. "If you will dance with me I shall be inspired," said Trent. Very banal, Lincoln muttered as the two floated away from him. "I'm so glad to be rescued from Lincoln," he told her. "He's so earnest and seems to think I have an ambulance in every pocket for him." "This begging, begging, begging is very tiresome," the Baroness admitted. She wished she might say exactly what she and her noble husband felt concerning it. She had understood that some of these artists and writers in the village were exceedingly liberal in their views. "Mrs. Adrian Beekman has been bothering me about giving ambulances all this afternoon." "She is most patriotic," he smiled, "but boring all the same." "I suppose you are one of these delightfully bad young men who say and do dreadful things," she hazarded a little later. "I am both delightful and bad," he admitted, "and a number of the things I've done and shall do are dreadful." "I'm afraid of you," she cried coquettishly. There was about her throat a magnificent necklace, evidently that of which Lincoln had spoken at the Scribblers' dinner. It was worth perhaps half of what the ambulance man had said. The stones were set in platinum. "I wonder you're not afraid of wearing such a magnificent necklace here," he said later. "Are you so dangerous as that?" she retorted. "Worse," he answered. She looked at him curiously. The Baroness liked young and good-looking men. Trent knew perfectly well what was going on in her mind. He had met women of this type before, women who could buy what they wanted and need not haggle at the price. Her eyes appraised him and she was satisfied with what she saw. "I believe you're just as bad as you pretend to be," she declared. "Do I disappoint you?" he demanded. "Of course," she laughed. "I shall have to reform you. I am very good at reforming fascinating men devils like you. You must come and have tea with me one afternoon." "What afternoon?" he asked. "Tomorrow," she said, "at 4?" If she had guessed with what repulsion she had inspired Trent she would have been startled. She was a type he detested. Later he said, "Isn't it unwise of you to wear such a gorgeous necklace at a mixed gathering like this?" "If it were real it would be," she answered. "Don't tell anyone," she commanded, "but this is only an imitation. The real one is on my dressing table. It was made in the Rue de la Paix for me and only an expert could tell the difference and then he'd have to know his business." "What are you frowning at?" he demanded when he saw her gaze directed toward a rather noisy group of newcomers. "These are my guests," she whispered. "I'd forgotten all about them. Doesn't that make you vain? I shall have to look after them. Later on they're all coming over to the house to have a bite to eat." She squeezed his hand. "You'd better come too." The Baroness was not usually so reckless in her invitations. She had learned it was not being done in those circles to which she aspired. But tonight she was unusually merry and there was something about Trent's keen, hawk-like type which appealed to her. Lincoln, she reflected, came of a good Boston family with houses in Beacon Street and Pride's Crossing, and his friend must be all right. No sooner had she moved toward her guests than Trent made his way to the street. Over his costume he wore a long black cloak which another than he had hired. Very few people were abroad. There was a slight fog and those who saw him were in no way amazed. Webster Hall dances had prepared the neighborhood for anything. He was not long in coming to Washington Square. It was in the block of houses on the north side that he was specially interested. From the other side of the road he gazed up at the Burton Trent house. Then going east a little he came to the door of the only apartment house in the block. It was not difficult for him to manipulate the lock. Quietly he climbed to the top of the house until he came to a ladder leading to the door on the roof. A few feet below him he could see the roof of the neighboring house. To this he dropped silently and walked along until the square skylight of the Burton Trent mansion was at hand. The bars that held the aperture were rusted. It required merely the exercise of strength to pry one of them loose. Underneath him was darkness. Since Trent had not come out originally on professional business he was without an electric torch. He had no idea how far the drop would be. Very carefully he crawled in and, hanging by one hand, struck a match. He dropped onto the floor of an attic used mainly for the storage of trunks. The door leading from the room was unlocked and he stepped out into a dark corridor. Looking over the balustrade he could see that the floor below was brilliantly lighted. From an article in a magazine devoted to interior decoration he had learned the complete layout of the residence. He knew, for example, that the servants slept in the L of the house, which abutted on the mews behind. Ordinarily he would have expected them to be in bed by this time. But the Baroness had told him she had guests coming in. There would inevitably be some servants making preparations. They would hardly have business on the second or third floors of the house. The Burton Trents, who had let their superb home as a war economy measure, would never allow any alteration of the arrangement of their wonderful furniture, and the Baroness would hardly be likely to venture to set her taste against that of a family she admired and indeed envied. It was therefore probable that the Baroness occupied the splendid sleeping chamber on the second floor front, an apartment to which the writer on interior decoration had devoted several pages. His borrowed cloak enveloping him, he descended the broad stairs until he stood at the entrance of the room he sought. It was indeed a magnificent place. His artistic sense delighted in it. Its furniture had once been in the sleeping room of a Venetian doge. It had cost a fortune to buy. The dressing room leading from it was lighted more brilliantly. There was a danger that the Baroness's maid might be there awaiting the return of her mistress. Chapter 15. The Baron lends a hand. "Hip, hip, hooray!" said the Baron again, and sank back into bibulous slumber. By his side on a tray was a half-emptied bottle of liqueur cognac and an open bottle of champagne. He had evidently been consuming over many champagne and brandy highballs. Anthony Trent considered him for a few moments in silence. He saw a way out of his difficulties and a certain ironical method of fooling investigation which pleased him more than a little. In a tall tumbler he mixed brandy and champagne, half and half, and poked the little Baron in the ribs. The familiar sight of being offered his favorite tipple made the trembling hand seize the glass. The contents was absorbed greedily and the Baron fell back on the chaise longue. The well-worn phrase, dead to the world, alone describes the condition of the Baron, who had married a brewery. Trent raised the man, he could have weighed no more than 100 pounds, in his strong arms and carried him across to the dressing table. And with the Baron's limp hands he opened the jewel case. Therefrom he extracted a necklace of diamonds set in platinum. What else was there he did not touch. He had a definitely planned course of action in view. The Baron's recording fingers closed the box. It would be as pretty a case of fingerprints as ever gladdened the heart of a Central Office detective. The Baron was next carried to the chaise longue. He would not wake for several hours. It would have been quite easy for Trent to make his escape undetected. But there was something else to be done first. He locked the door of the Venetian bedroom and then took up the telephone receiver. His carefully trained memory recorded the accent and voice of the Baron von Eckstein as he had heard it during an evening at the theatre. He called a telephone number. Fortunately it was a private wire connecting with the central. "I wish to speak to Mrs. Adrian Beekman," he said, when at length there was an answer to his call. "She is in bed," a sleepy voice returned. "She can't be disturbed." "She must be," said Trent, mimicking the Baron. "It is a matter of vast importance. Tell her a gentleman wishes to present her ambulance fund with a large sum of money. Tomorrow will be too late." "I'll see what can be done," said the voice. "That's about the only matter I dare disturb her on. Hold the wire." "Madame," said Trent a minute later, "it is the Baron von Eckstein who has the honor to speak with you." "An odd hour to choose," returned Mrs. Adrian Beekman with no cordiality. "I wish to make reparation, madame," the pseudo-Baron flung back. "This afternoon you talked to my wife, the Baroness, about your ambulances." "And found her not interested in the least," Mrs. Beekman said, a little crossly. So eminent a leader of society as she was not accustomed to refusal of a donation when asked of rich women striving for social recognition. "We have decided that your cause is one which should have met a more generous response. I have been accused of being disloyal. That is false, madame. My wife has been attacked as pro-German. That is also false. To prove our loyalty, we have decided to send you a diamond necklace. Convert this into money and buy what ambulances you can." "Do you mean this?" said the astonished Mrs. Adrian Beekman. "I am never more serious," retorted the Baron. "What value has it?" she asked next. "You'll get $50,000 at least," he said. 10 ambulances!" she cried. "Oh, Baron, how very generous! I'm afraid I've cherished hard feelings about you both that have not been justified. How perfectly splendid of you!" "One other thing," said the Baron. "I am sending this by a trusted messenger at once. Please see that someone reliable is there to receive it." It was safer, Trent thought, to gain the square over the roofs and down the stairways of the apartment house. It was now raining and hardly a soul was in view. The Adrian Beekman house was only a block distant. They were of the few who retained family mansions on the lower end of Fifth Avenue. He knocked at the Beekman door and a manservant opened it. In the shadows the man could only see the dark outline of the messenger. "I am the Baron von Eckstein," he said, still with his carefully mimicked accent. "This is the package of which I spoke to your mistress." It seemed when he got back to Webster Hall that none had missed him. The first to speak was the Baroness. "We're just going over to the house," she said cordially. "I don't want to share you," he said, smiling, "with all these others. I'd rather come tomorrow at 4. May I?" At 4 on the next day Anthony Trent, dressed in the best of taste as a man of fashion and leisure, ascended the steps to the Burton Trent home and wondered, as others had done before him, at the amazing fowl which guarded its approach. He was kept waiting several minutes. From the distant reception rooms he heard acrimonious voices. One was the Baron's, and it pleased him to note that he had caught its inflections so well the night before. The other voice was that of his new friend, the Baroness. Unfortunately, the conversation was in German and its meaning incomprehensible. When at last he was shown into a drawing room, he found the Baroness highly excited and not a little indignant. She was too much overwrought to take much interest in her new acquaintance. Almost she looked as though she wished he had not come. Things rarely looked so rosy to the Baroness as they did after a good dinner, and it was but 4 o'clock. "What has disturbed you?" he asked. "Everything," she retorted. "Mainly my husband. Tell me, if you were a woman and your husband in a drunken fit gave away a diamond necklace to an enemy, would you be calm about it?" "Has that happened?" he demanded. "It has," she snapped. "You remember I told you at the dance I'd left the original necklace at home for safety?" "I believe you did mention it," he said, meditating. "I'd much better have worn it, Mr. Trent. Everybody knows the Baron's passion is for cognac and champagne. No man since time began has ever drunk so much of them. When we got back here last night we had a gay and festive time. It was almost light when I went to my room and found the necklace gone. I sobered the Baron and he could give absolutely no explanation. He said he had slept in the dressing room to guard the jewels. That was nonsense. He came there to worry my maid. She went to bed and left him drinking. The police came in and took all the servants' fingerprints and tried to fasten the thing on them. There were marks on the jewel case where someone's hands had been put. I offered a reward of $5,000 for anyone who could point out the man or woman who had taken the necklace." Trent kept his countenance to the proper pitch of interest and sympathy. It was not easy. "What have the police found?" "Wait," the Baroness commanded. "You shall hear everything. This morning I received a letter from Mrs. Adrian Beekman. You know who she is, of course. She thanked me, rather patronizingly, for giving my diamond necklace to her ambulance fund. She said she had sold it to a Mexican millionaire for $50,000, enough to buy 10 ambulances." "How did she get the necklace?" Trent asked seriously. "That husband of mine," she returned. "The Baron did it. Can only think that in his maudlin condition he remembered what I told him at dinner about being bothered by the Beekman woman for a cause I'm not very much in sympathy with. There's no other explanation. It all fits." Chapter 16. The Mount Aubyn Ruby. It was while Trent was shaving that the lamp fell. He started, blessed the man who invented safety razors that he had not gashed himself, and went into his library to see what had happened. Mrs. Kinney, his housekeeper, was volubly apologetic. "I was only dusting it," she explained, "when it came down. I think it's no more than bent." It was a hanging lamp of Benares brasswork, not of much value, but Trent liked its quaint design and the brilliant flashing of the cut-colored glass that embellished it. 4 eyes of light looked out on the world when the lamp was lit. White, green, blue and red eyes of the size of filbert nuts. He stooped down and picked up the shattered red glass. It was the sole damage done by Mrs. Kinney's activity. "It will cost only a few cents to have it repaired," he commented, and went back to the bathroom and speedily forgot the whole matter. At breakfast Anthony Trent admitted he was bored. There had been little excitement in his recent work. The niceness of calculation, the careful planning and dexterous carrying out of his affairs had netted him a great deal of money with very little risk. There had been risk often enough, but not within the past few months. His thoughts went back to some of his more noteworthy feats, and he smiled. He chuckled at the episode of the bank president whom he had given in charge for picking his pocket when he had just relieved the financier of the choicest contents of his safe. Trent's specialty was adroit handling of situations which would have been too much for the ordinary criminal. He had an aplomb, an ingenious air, and was so diametrically opposed to the common conception of a burglar that people had often apologized to him whose homes he had looted. It was his custom to read through 2 of the leading morning papers after breakfast. It was necessary that he should keep himself fully informed of the movements of society, of engagements, divorces and marriages. It was usually among people of this sort that he operated. To the columns devoted to lost articles he gave special attention. More than once he had seen big rewards offered for things that he had concealed in his rooms, and although the comforting phrase "no questions asked" invariably accompanied the advertisement, he never made application for the reward. In this Trent differed from the usual practitioner of crime. When he had abandoned fiction for a more diverting sport, he had formulated regulations for his professional conduct drawn up with extraordinary care. It was the first article of his faith under no circumstances to go to a fence or disposer of stolen goods or to visit pawn shops. It is plain to see such precautions were wise. Sooner or later the police get the fence and with him the man's clientele. Every man who sells to a fence puts his safety in another's keeping, and Anthony Trent was minded to play the game alone. As to the pawn shops, daily the police regulations expose more searchingly the practices of those who bear the arms of old Lombardy above their doors. The court news is full of convictions obtained by the police detailed to watch the pawnbroker's customers. It was largely on this account that Trent specialized on currency and remained unknown to the authorities. On this particular morning the newspapers offered nothing of interest except to say that a certain Italian duke, whose cousin had recently become engaged to an American girl of wealth and position, was about to cross the ocean and bear with him family jewels as a wedding gift from the great house he represented. Methodically Trent made a note of this. Later he took the subway downtown to consult with his brokers on the purchase of certain oil stocks. He had hardly taken his seat when Horace Weems pounced upon him. This Weems was an energetic creature, by instinct and training a salesman, so proud of his art and so certain of himself that he was wont to boast he could sell hot tamales in hell. By shrewdness he had amassed a comfortable fortune. He was a short blond man nearly always capable of profuse perspirations. Trent knew by Weems' excitement that there was at hand either an entrancingly beautiful girl, as Weems saw beauty, or a very rich man. Only these 2 spectacles were capable of bringing Weems' smooth cheeks to this flush of excitement. Weems sometimes described himself as a money hound. "You see that man coming toward us?" Weems whispered. Trent looked up. There were 3 men advancing. One was a heavily built man of late middle age with a disagreeable face, dominant chin and hard gray eyes. The other two were younger and had that alert bearing which men gain whose work requires a sound body and courage. "Are they arresting him?" Trent demanded. He noticed that they were very close to the elder man. They might be Central Office men. "Arresting him?" Weems whispered, still excitedly. "I should say not. You don't know who he is." "I only know that he must be rich," Trent returned. "That's one of the wealthiest men in the country," Weems told him. "That's Jerome Dangerfield." "Your news leaves me unmoved," said the other. "I never heard of him." "He hates publicity," Weems informed him. "If a paper prints a line about him it's his enemy, and it don't pay to have the enmity of a man worth nearly 100 millions. "What's his line?" Trent demanded. "Everything," Weems said enthusiastically. "He owns half the mills in New Bedford for one thing, and then there's real estate in this village and Chicago." Weems sighed. "If I had his money I'd buy a paper and have myself spread all over it, and he won't have a line." "I'm not sure he has succeeded in keeping it out. I'd swear that I've read something about him. It comes back clearly. It was something about jewels. I remember now. It was Mrs. Jerome Dangerfield who bought a famous ruby that the war compelled an English marchioness to sell." The thing was quite clear to him now. He was on his favorite topic. "It was known as the Mount Aubyn ruby after the family which had it so long." He turned to look at the well-guarded financier. "So that's the man whose wife has that blood-stained jewel." "What do you mean blood-stained?" Weems demanded. "It's one of the tragic stones of history," said the other. "Men have sold their lives for it and women their honor. One of the former marquises of Mount Aubyn killed his best friend in a duel for it. God knows what blood was spilled for it in India before it went to Europe." "You don't believe all that junk, do you?" asked Weems. "Junk?" the other flung back at him. "Have you ever looked at the ruby?" "Sure I have," Weems returned aggrieved. "Haven't you seen my ruby stickpin?" "Which represents to you only so many dollars and is, after all, only a small stone. If you'd ever looked into the heart of a ruby you'd know what I mean. There's a million little lurking devils in it, Weems, taunting you, mocking you, making you covet it and ready to do murder to have it for your own." Weems looked at him, startled for the moment. He had never known his friend so intense, so unlike his careless, debonair self. "For the moment," said Weems, "I thought you meant it. Of course you used to write fiction and that explains it." To his articles of faith Anthony Trent added another paragraph. He swore not to let his enthusiasm run away with him when he discussed jewels. Weems was safe enough. He was lucky to be in no other company. But suppose he had babbled to one of those keen-eyed men engaged in guarding Jerome Dangerfield, the multimillionaire who shunned publicity? He determined to choose another subject. "What does he take those men around with him for?" he asked. "A very rich man is pestered to death," the wise Weems said. "Cranks try to interest him in all sorts of fool schemes and crazy men try to kill him for being a capitalist. And then there's beggars and charities and blackmailers. Nobody can get next to him. I know. I've tried. I've never seen him in the subway before. I guess his car broke down and he had to come with the herd." "So you tried? What was your scheme?" "I forget now," Weems admitted. "I've had so many good things since. I followed out a stunt of that crook Conway Parker you used to write about. In one of your stories you made him want to meet a millionaire and instead of going to his office you made him go to the Fifth Avenue home and fool the butlers and flunkies. It won't work, old man. I know. I handed the head butler my hat and cane but that was as far as I got.
There must be a high sign in that sort of a house that I wasn't wise to." Weems mused on his defeat for a few seconds. "I ought to have worn a monocle." He brightened. "Anyway, just as I came out of the door a lady friend passed by on the top of a bus and saw me. Now, you're a good looker, old man, and high class and all that, but you and I don't belong in places like Millionaire's Row." "Too bad," said Trent, smiling. He wondered what Weems would have said if he had known that his friend had within the week been to a reception in one of the greatest of the Fifth Avenue palaces and there gazed at a splendid ruby, not half the size of the Mount Aubyn stone, on the yellowing neck of an aged lady of many loves. When Weems was shaken off, Dangerfield and his attendants vanished, and Trent had placed an order with his brokers, he walked over to Park Row, where he had once worked as a cub reporter. Contrary to his usual custom, he entered a saloon well patronized by the older order of newspaper men who graduated in a day when it was possible to drink hard and hold a responsible position. He had barely crossed the threshold when he heard the voice of the man he sought. It was Clark, slave to the archdemon Rum. He was trying to borrow enough money from a monotype man who had admitted backing a winner to get a prescription filled for a suffering wife. The monotype man, either disbelieving Clark's story or having little regard for wifely suffering, was indisposed to share his winnings with druggist or bartender. It was at this moment that Clark caught sight of his old reporter and more recent benefactor. He dropped the monotype man with all the outraged pride of an erstwhile city editor and shook Trent's hand cordially. His own trembled. "That might be managed," said Trent, listening to his request gravely. "But first have a drink to steady your nerves." They repaired to a little alcove and sat down. Clark was not anxious to leave so pleasant a spot. He talked entertainingly and was ready to expatiate on his former glories. "By the way," said Trent presently, "you used to know the inside history and hidden secrets of every big man in town." "I do yet," Clark insisted eagerly. "What's on your mind?" "Nothing in particular," said the other idly, "but I came downtown on the subway and saw Jerome Dangerfield with his two strong-arm men. What's he afraid of, and why won't he have publicity?" "That swinehound!" Clark exclaimed. "Why wouldn't he be afraid of publicity with his record? You're too young to remember, but I know." "What do you know?" Trent demanded. "I know that he's worse than the leader said he was when I was on the staff 20 years back. That was why the old leader went out of business. He put it out. A paper is a business institution and won't antagonize a vicious two-handed fighter like Dangerfield unless it's necessary. That's why they leave him alone. The big political parties get campaign contributions from him. Why stir him up?" "But you haven't told me what he did." "Women," said Clark briefly. "You know, boy, that some men are born women hunters. That may be natural enough, but if it's a game, play it fair. Pay for your folly. He didn't. You ask me why he has those guards with him? It's to protect him from the fathers of young girls who've sworn to get him. His bosom pal got his at a roof garden a dozen years back, and Dangerfield's watching night and day. He's bad all through. The stuff we had on him at the Leader would make you think you were back in decadent Rome." "What's his wife like?" "Society. Whole society. Handsome, they tell me, and not any too much brain, but domineering. Full of precious stones. I'm told every servant is a detective. I guess they are, as you never heard of any of their valuables being taken. It makes me thirsty to think of it." Trent, when he had obtained the information he desired, left Clark with enough money to buy medicine for his wife. With the bartender he left sufficient to pay for a taxi to the boarding house of Mrs. Sawyer, where he himself had once resided. Clarke would need it. On his way uptown he found himself thinking continuously of Jerome Dangerfield and the Mount Aubyn ruby. There would be excitement in going after such a prize. The Dangerfield household was one into which thieves had not been able to break nor steal. A man, to make a successful Chapter 17. Trent Takes a Holiday. At a sporting goods store that afternoon he ran into Jerome Dangerfield again. He had just bought a dozen balls when he saw the millionaire and his two attendants. He was not minded to be observed of them, so slipped into the little room where putters may be tried and drives be made into nets. From where he was he could hear Dangerfield's disagreeable, rasping voice. His grievance, it seemed, was that other golfers were able to get better balls than he. He badgered the clerk until the man found spirit to observe, "If there was a ball that would make a dub play good golf, it would be worth a fortune to anyone." Trent was able to see the look of anger the capitalist threw at him. And this anger he saw reflected on the faces of the two attendants. Decidedly, any lone man pitting his courage and wit against the Dangerfield entourage would need sympathy. "Set me half gross up to Sunset Park Hotel," he heard Dangerfield say as he walked away, still frowning. "I hope you don't have many of that kind to wait on," Trent said sympathetically. He was always courteous to those with whom he had dealings. "He's the limit," said the clerk, "and from the way he looked at me I guess the boss will hear of it. Seemed to think there was a ball that would make him drive 250 and hole a 20-foot putt, and I was trying to hide it from him. You wouldn't think it, but he's one of the richest men living. Gee, it makes me feel like a socialist when I think of it." The clerk wondered why it was a superb golfer, as he knew Trent to be, was modest and courteous, while a man like Dangerfield was so overbearing. Before he went home Trent looked up Sunset Park in a golfer's guide. It was a little known course among the Berkshires, with only 9 holes to its credit. The rates of the hotel were sufficiently high to make it clear only the rich could play. It was probably one of these dreary courses where a scratch player would be a rara avis, a course to which elderly men playing for their health gravitated and made the lives of caddies miserable. It was a curious thing, Trent thought, that while this morning he knew nothing of Dangerfield, by night he knew a great deal. An evening paper told him why the millionaire was going to the Berkshires. There was to be a wedding in high society, and the bride was a niece of Mrs. Jerome Dangerfield. The ceremony would take place at the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd, and a bishop would unite the contracting parties. The fancy dress ball to be held would be the most elaborate ever held outside New York. A great pavilion was to be erected for the occasion in the grounds of the bride's magnificent home, and Newport would be for the moment deserted. It was rumored that the jewels to be worn would exceed in value anything that had ever been gathered together this side the Atlantic, and so on, 2 columns long. It explained very clearly why the Jerome Dangerfields were going to Sunset Park. The collective value of the jewels appealed particularly to Trent. He wondered if the Mount Aubyn ruby would shine out on that festal night, and if so, how would it be guarded? It would be less difficult to disguise the detectives in fancy costume than in evening dress. Of course, the owner of such a world-famous gem might wear an imitation, as the Baroness von Eckstein had done, but if Clark had painted her aright, this was an occasion when an ambitious woman would be willing to take risks. The proprietors of the Sunset Park Hotel were glad to accommodate Mr. Anthony Trent with a bed and bathroom for a little over $100 a week. It was a very select resort, they explained, attracting such people as the Jerome Dangerfields and their friends. The golf course was owned by the hotel, and the first tee was on a lawn a few yards from the front piazza. On the morning following his arrival, Trent, golf clubs already allotted to a caddy, waited to see what kind of golf was played. They were indifferently good, but he betrayed little attention until he saw Dangerfield coming. Immediately he went to the tee, but did not make his first shot until the millionaire was near enough to see. Playing alone, as was the capitalist, for few were yet on the links, he had not to wait, as he must have done had the other been playing with a partner. The first green was distant 160 yards from the tee. A brook with sedgy reeds was a fine natural hazard, and as the green was on an elevated plateau with deep grass beyond, it was not an easy one to reach. Dangerfield dreaded it. Dangerfield saw a tall, slim young man correctly clad in breeches and stockings, using a mashie, drop his ball neatly on the green within putting distance of the hole. Later he saw the hole done in 2 which was 1 under par. "Who is that man?" Dangerfield demanded of his caddy. "Never seen him before," the lad answered. Dangerfield took his brassey and went straightway into the brook. He saw, however, as he was ball hunting, this stranger make a wonderful drive to the second. 250 yards, the enthusiastic caddy swore. Meanwhile the millionaire continued to press and slice and pull and top his ball to such effect as to do the double round in 142. Nothing exasperated him so much as to find the game mock his strength and desire. A power wherever money marts were, he was here openly laughed at by caddies. He was discovering that rank on the links is determined by skill at the game alone. What mattered it that he was the great Jerome Dangerfield? What had he done the round in? What was his handicap? He particularly wanted to humble Stephen Goswell, president of the First Agricultural Bank of New York City. Goswell was a year ahead of him at the game and had the edge on him so far. Goswell could manage short approaches occasionally, strokes that were beyond his own inflexible wrists. Now this tall, dark stranger had such strokes to perfection. The ball driven up into the air skimmed tree, wall or bunker and rolled up to the pin sweetly. Dangerfield quickly made up his mind. He would invite the stranger to play with him and then get hints which would improve his game 50%. "Morning," he said later at the 19th hole, where the stranger was taking a drink. "Good morning," said the stranger rather stiffly. It is evident, thought Dangerfield, he does not know who I am. "Going round again after lunch?" Dangerfield demanded. "I think so," the stranger responded. "We might play together," said Dangerfield. "I haven't a partner." "I'm afraid that won't make a good match," Trent told him. "Surely there is someone more your strength who would make a better match of it." Grunted the other. "Think I don't play well enough, eh?" "I know it," said Trent composedly. Dangerfield regarded him sourly. "You're not overburdened with modesty, young man." "I hope not," the other retorted. "Nothing handicaps a man more in life. I happen to know golf, though, and my experience is that if I play with a much inferior player I get careless and that's bad for my game. I'm perfectly frank about it. You know next to nothing about the game. In your own line of work you could no doubt give me a big beating because you know it and I don't." "And what do you suppose my line of work is?" snapped the annoyed mill owner. "I don't know," Trent commented. "Either a dentist or a theatrical producer." As he spoke up sauntered one of the two men with whom he had seen Dangerfield in the subway. "I'd like to hire someone to take the starch out of you," Dangerfield said as he rose to his feet. "Quite easy," Trent returned. "Almost any professional could." He watched the two walk away and chuckled. He had attracted the millionaire's attention and he had rebuffed him. So far his program was being carried out on scheduled time. The attendant had not looked at him with any special interest. It was unlikely in different clothes, under other conditions and in a strange place he would recognize him. He did not play again that day. Instead he paid attention to some elderly ladies who knitted feverishly and were inclined to talk. He learned a great deal of useful news. For example, that the Dangerfields always had meals in their big private suite and rarely without guests from nearby homes. That they quarreled constantly. That Mr. Dangerfield never went to bed wholly sober. That he was given to sudden gusts of temper and only last year had beaten a caddie and had been compelled to settle the assault with a large money payment. That he was not above pocketing a golf ball if he could do so without being observed. That he had several times been seen to lift his ball out of an unfavorable lie into one from which he could play with greater chance of making a good stroke. These petty meannesses Trent had already surmised. Dangerfield seemed to him that sort of a man. He was more interested in the dinner parties. But a man in such a position as he was had to be careful as to what questions he asked. People had a knack of remembering them at inopportune moments. Fortunately one of the ladies, who was a Miss Northend of Lynn, came back to it. She was a furious knitter and knitted best when her tongue wagged. "Of course this hotel belongs to Mr. Dangerfield," she babbled, "and that explains why they have a palatial suite here and can entertain even more readily than if they had a summer home, as their friends have. This is a very fashionable section. The women dress here as if they were in Newport. Every night Mr. Dangerfield goes down to the hotel safe and brings something gorgeous in the jewelry way for his wife to wear. There's a private stairway he uses. I wandered into it once, Chapter 18. The Great Black Bird. There was exactly 1 week to the night of the fancy dress dance at the Uplands from the time that the Northern sisters gave the abstractor so much information. Every moment of it was carefully taken up by that calculating gentleman. For example, on the following morning, Wednesday, he played a round with the club's champion, an amateur of some skill. Dangerfield, posing for the moment as a warm admirer of the local player, followed the two on their match, betting freely on Blackhall, his club mate. Also, he violated every rule of the royal and ancient game by speaking as Trent made his strokes. Never in his 10 years of golf had Trent played such a game. It was characteristic of him to do his best when conditions were worst. When the game was over at the 13th hole, Dangerfield turned crossly to Blackhall. "You played a rotten game," he said. "I never played a better," that golfer exclaimed. "The whole trouble with me was that I was up against a better man." It may be observed that Blackhall was a sportsman. Dangerfield was astonished and gratified next day when he was essaying some approaching to find Trent watching his efforts in a not unfriendly spirit. "The trouble with you," said the younger player graciously, "is that you chop your stroke instead of carrying through. I'll show you what I mean." In the half hour he devoted to Dangerfield he improved the millionaire's game 6 strokes to a round. "It would be no fun to play with you," he said when Dangerfield again invited him, "but I hate to see a man trying to approach as you did when a little help could put him right." Thus were any Dangerfield suspicions disarmed. He helped him once or twice more and on every occasion insisted that the hovering attendant be sent away. "Your keeper," said Trent genially, "puts me off my stroke." "Keeper?" grinned Dangerfield. "I'm not as bad as that. He's my valet." 2 days before the ball at the Uplands it was observed that Anthony Trent visited the 19th hole more frequently and stayed there longer. He was playing less golf now. The bartender confided in Mr. Dangerfield, who was also a consistent patron, that he was drinking heavily. "I guess," said the tender of the bar with the sapience of his kind, "that he's one of these quiet periodic souses. They tell me he has the stuff sent up to his room." "Too bad," said Mr. Dangerfield, shaking his head as he ordered another. It was true that to Trent's room much dry gin and lemon juice found its way, together with siphons of iced carbonic. The carbonic and the lemon juice was drunk, since a belated heat wave was visiting the Sunset Park Hotel. The gin found its way into his flower-laden window boxes, which should have bloomed into juniper berries. Trent liked to drink as well as any other golfer, but he found that it just took the keen edge off his nerves. He was less keen to realize danger and too ready to meet a risk when he drank. As a conscientious workman he put it behind him when professionally engaged. On the night of the ball he was, to quote a bellboy, "dead to the world," which proves that bellboys may be deceived by appearances. On the night of the ball he was keyed up to his highest personal efficiency. Physically he was at his best. His muscles were always hard and his wind good. The resisting exercises he practiced maintained the former and a little running every day aided the latter. The great costume ball was to take place on the 3rd of September, when the sun would set at 6:30. The Uplands was no more than a half-hour motor spin distance from the hotel. The time was set at 9:30, which meant few would be there before 10. It was plain then that Mrs. Jerome Dangerfield would not commence her preparations for dressing until after the dinner. She was devoted to the pleasures of the table, as her maid lamented when she harnessed her mistress within her corsets. Looking from his window, Trent saw that the sun had retired behind clouds early in the afternoon. Darkness would not be delayed, and the success of his venture depended upon this. Reviewing the amazing events of the evening of September the 3rd, it is only fair to let Jerome Dangerfield relieve his feelings in a letter to his closest friend, the president of the First Agricultural Bank of New York. You were right in warning me not to bring the Mount Aubyn ruby up to this place. It was Adele's fault. She wanted it for the wedding. The damned thing has gone, Steve, vanished into thin air. If you told me what I'm going to tell you, I should say you were crazy. The people here and the fool police thought I'd been drinking. I'd had 3 or 4 cocktails, but what is that to me or you? I was absolutely in possession of my senses. We dined early and we dined alone. At 8 I went down for the jewels Adele wanted to wear. The ruby was the pièce de résistance, of course. I went down my own private stairway as usual and unlocked the door leading from it to the hotel lobby. Devlin is here and O'Brien, but they were both outside keeping tabs on strangers. The papers have played this costume ball up so much that every crook in the land knew what we had to offer in the way of loot. Graham, the hotel clerk, came with me to the private stairway and swears he pushed the door to as I started to go up the stairs. And he swears also that, although it wasn't lighted as well as usual, there was nobody in sight. They're steep stairs, Steve, but they save me rubbing shoulders with every man or woman who might want to get acquainted in the public elevators. And naturally I wasn't carrying a fortune or any crook could get a crack at me. Read this carefully. I was on the 15th step of the flight of 22 steps when the thing happened. The light was dim because one of the bulbs wasn't working, and the only illumination came from a red light at the head of the stairway. I was holding the jewel box in both hands, resting it almost on my chest, when the thing happened. There was suddenly a noise that might have been made by the beating of wings, and something swooped out of nowhere and hit me on my wrists with such violence that I went backwards down the stairs and was unconscious for more than 10 minutes. On each wrist there is an abrasion that might be caused by the sharp bill of a big bird. I am bruised all over and have 3 stitches over one eye. I found the box lying on one of the steps, closed as I had held it. The only thing that was missing was the Mount Aubyn ruby. Devlin and O'Brien have all kinds of theories, but I told them I wanted the stone back, and if they didn't get it, I wouldn't have them any longer in my employ. Devlin says he will swear a car passed him on the Boston road yesterday containing some continental crooks who used to operate along the Italian and French Riviera. He's full of wild fancies and swears I shall get the ruby back. I'm not so sure. I've given up the theory that it was a great black bat which hit me, but whatever it was a stunt pulled by a master craftsman who is laughing at Devlin and his kind. Can you imagine a crook who would leave behind what this fellow did? I wish you'd go to the Pemberton Detective Agency and get them to send someone up here capable of handling the situation. Shall be coming down to New York as soon as I'm able. I'm too much bruised to play golf, but when I do I shall win some of your money. I've had some lessons from a crackerjack golfer up here who goes round the 18 holes in anything from 72 to 78. My stance was wrong and I wasn't gripping right. So much for Jerome Dangerfield. When Devlin and O'Brien examined the scene of the crime, they immediately noticed that some 15 feet above the ground level a stained glass window lighted the stairway. "Of course!" they exclaimed in unison. "That is the solution." But the theory did not hold water, as the soil of the flower beds showed no sign of a ladder or any footmark. They had been raked over that afternoon, and the gardener swore no foot but his had set foot in this enclosed garden which supplied the hotel tables with blooms. An examination of the window showed no helpful finger marks. It was an indoor job, they declared, amending their first opinion. But they were thorough workmen in their way. For instance, Anthony Trent, reclining fully dressed across his bed, with cigarette stubs and emptied glasses about him, within 30 minutes of the robbery, was evidently in fear of interruption. An onlooker would have seen him take 3 gin fizzes in rapid succession until indeed his face wore a faint flush. He listened keenly when outside his door footsteps lingered, and he was snoring alcoholically when the hotel clerk entered, bringing with him Messrs. Devlin and O'Brien. "He's been like this for days," Graham, the clerk, asserted. "If it wasn't that he was no trouble and made no noise, I should have told him to get out." "A pity." Graham shook his head. "One of the pleasantest spoken men in the hotel and some golfer, they tell me." "You leave us," Devlin commanded. "We're acting for the boss and it'll be all right." Out of the corner of his eye Trent watched the 2 trained men make a thorough examination of his room and effects. Indeed, their thoroughness gave him ideas which were later to prove of use. But they drew blank. They examined the 2 fly rods he had brought with him and a collapsible landing net with great care, tapping the handles and balancing the rods. They sighed when nothing was found. "This guy's all right," said O'Brien. "I don't know," said Devlin. "He looks a little too much like a moving picture hero to suit me. He may have it on him." At this moment Trent sat up with an effort and looked from one to the other of the visitors. As drunken men do, it appeared not easy to get them in proper focus. Devlin was not easily put in the wrong. His manner was most respectful. "Mr. Dangerfield wants you to join him in a little game of bridge," he began ingratiatingly. "Sure," said the inebriate. "Any time at all." He attempted to get up. "You can't go like this," Devlin assured him. "You'd better sober up a bit. Take a cold bath." O'Brien obligingly turned the water on and 5 minutes later Devlin assisted him into the tub while O'Brien examined the clothes he had left in his sitting room. Then the 2 left him abruptly and made no more mention of bridge or Dangerfield. Trent rolled on the bed chuckling. The honors were his. The great black bird swooping from nowhere to relieve Dangerfield of his great ruby and other stones of value, to strike that worthy upon his strong wrists with such startling effect as to make him fall down a dozen steps, was capable of a simpler explanation than he had supposed. Trent, a week before the robbery, had observed with peculiar attention the window leading to Dangerfield's private stairway. He could see one easy approach to it and one of greater difficulty. The first was approached by a stepladder. The second was a great arm of the enormous tree that reared its head above the hotel roof. This arm hung down from the roof almost 20 feet above the little window. He believed that his weight would bring it swaying down to the window ledge. He tried it one moonless night and found the scheme feasible. Already the chiller mountain breezes following the heat spell were making visitors close their windows. On the evening of the 3rd of September he stole from his room by climbing over the roof until he came to the side where the big tree was. In one hand he held a coil of rope to hold the branch when his weight was taken off it. This rope he tied to the iron staple of the shutter outside the window. It was easy to open this. Dropping silently onto the stairs, he unscrewed the bulb of the light until the staircase was in partial darkness. Tense, he knelt on the edge of the window and waited for the millionaire. And as the man came in sight, he suddenly lifted from a step his landing net, the same collapsible one Devlin had examined with such care. But this time it was draped in dark material to conceal its form. The brass rim, sharp and heavy, struck Dangerfield's wrists as he held the box by both hands on a level with his heart. Into the open net the precious casket fell silently. Trent was in his room 10 minutes ere Dangerfield came to consciousness. His next move seemed strange and unnecessary. With a used golf ball in his pocket he slid down the veranda posts until he came by devious routes to the shed in which the lockers were of those who used the links. It had long since been closed for the night. Parker unfastened Dangerfield's locker and placed the ball in the pocket, where it lay with others of similar age and make. He was able to return to his room unobserved.
It was less than a half hour afterward that he received his call from the two detectives. Although he was anxious to get on the links again and breathe the air of the pine woods, he was careful not to undo his artistic preparations. It was noticed that no more drink was sent to his room. There came instead ice water and strong coffee. He was getting over it, they said. 2 days later he was out on the links and made a peculiarly bad round, taking 10 more strokes than usual. Dangerfield watched him from the piazza. One of his arms was in a sling. "Cut the rough stuff out," said Dangerfield. "That's the second time he topped your ball." Trent passed a hand across his face, possibly to hide a smile. "I guess I'll have to," he returned simply. "It was that damned heat wave that got me going." It happened that the Dangerfields and Trent returned to New York on the same train. Devlin and O'Brien were in attendance. Trent noticed that when Devlin's eye fell on the golf bag over his shoulder he frowned. So far the ruby had not been recovered, and here was a piece of baggage that might hold crown jewels. Over Devlin's broad shoulders his master's golf bag was suspended. Cheerily and with respect he approached the crack player. "Let me hold your golf bag, sir," he said with a ready smile. "I'll put it on the train for you." Trent relinquished it with relief. "Thank you," he returned. "It will be a help." He had long ago noticed that his own bag and Dangerfield's were alike save for the initials. They were both of white canvas, bound with black leather. Watching the smiling Devlin with a well-disguised curiosity, he saw that Dangerfield's bag had been substituted for his own. Devlin had done exactly as Trent expected him to do and had, in the doing of it, saved him much trouble. There were not many people in his Pullman. Dangerfield had his private car. None saw Anthony Trent open the ball pouch on the Dangerfield bag and extract therefrom an aged and somewhat dented ball. He balanced it almost lovingly in his hand. Never in the history of the great game had a ball been seen with the worth of this one. And yet he had so cunningly extracted its core and repaired it when once the Mount Aubyn ruby was nestling in its strange home that detection was unlikely, even were an examination made. A porter had the Dangerfield bag and Trent's suitcase when Devlin came up to him. He was no longer obliging. He had spent wearisome hours in the privacy of the Dangerfield car examining every part of Chapter 19. Trent Acquires a Home.
One day, months before the affair of the 10 ambulances, Horace Weems had seen Anthony Trent about to enter Xera's excellent restaurant. Lacking no assurance, Weems tacked himself on to his friend. "Say, do you feed here?" he demanded, and looked with respect at his friend's raiment. "Only when I'm hungry," Trent retorted. He knew it was useless to try to get rid of Weems. "Have you dined?" "Thanks," said Weems. "I don't mind if I do." In those days Weems was proud as the owner of the finest camp on Lake Kennebago. He was high-stomached and generous of advice. He told Trent so much of a certain stock, a gold mine in Colorado, that at last he purchased a considerable interest in it. Later he learned that Weems had unloaded worthless stock on him. Trent bore no sort of malice. He had gone into the thing open-eyed, and Weems, as he knew of yore, never sold at a loss. Weems had been wiser to have held his stock, for tungsten in large quantities was discovered, and what cost Trent $5,000 was now worth 10 times that amount. It was one evening shortly after his adventures with the Baron von Eckstein that Weems called him up on the telephone. That he was able to do so annoyed Trent, who had carefully concealed his number. But Horace Weems had secured it by a use of mendacity, and with it the number and the address. He said he was phoning from a nearby drugstore and was about to pay a visit. Weems was ill at ease, and he was unshaven and his shoes no longer shone with radiance. His dishevelled appearance and attitude of dejection swept away his host's annoyance. He took a stiff Scotch and seltzer. "Little Horace Weems," he announced, "has got it in the neck." "What's happened?" Trent demanded. "Got that Wall Street bunch sore on me and hadn't the sense to see the danger signals." Weems soothed his throat with another stiff drink. "The trouble with me is I'm too courageous. I knew what I was up against, but did that frighten me? No siree. No boss. I went for 'em like you used to go through a bunch of forwards in a football game. I'm like a bull terrier. I'm all fight. Size doesn't worry me. They pulled me down at last, but it took all the best brains in the street to do it. They hate a comer, and I'm that. Well, this is the first round, and they win on points. But this isn't a limited bout. You watch, little Horace. I'll have a turbine steam yacht yet, and all the trimmings. Follow me and you'll wear diamonds or rags, nothing between. Rags or diamonds." Weems was a long time coming to the point. When he did, it was revealed as a loan, a temporary loan. "It's like this," said the ingenious Weems. "When I sold you those shares in a tungsten mine, I did it because you were a friend." "You did it," Trent reminded him, "because you hadn't a faint idea there was tungsten there and you thought you'd done something mighty clever. What next?" "You needn't be sore about it," Weems returned. "You made money." "I'm not sore," Trent said smiling. "You did me a good turn, but I don't have to be grateful, all things considering. How much do you want?" "I shall get back," Weems said a little sulkily. "I only want 100 or maybe 200, although 500 would see me through till I get the money for the camp." "You're not going to sell that?" Trent cried. It was of all places the one he craved. "Got to," Weems asserted. "Who's going to buy it?" "A fellow from Cleveland named Rumley." "I remember him," Trent said, frowning. "He's a hog, a fish hog. All the guides hate him. What's he going to give you?" 40,000, said Weems. "Constable, grand piano and all?" "The piano's there," Weems told him, "but the picture is sold. Honest, Tony, that picture surprised me. Senator Scrivener gave me $10,000 for it. Just some trees, an old barn and some horses looking over a gate. What do you know about that? That helped me some." You're such a damned liar, Weems, that I never believe you, but I'll swear Rumley isn't paying you $40,000 for that camp. It's a good camp, but if you got to sell in a hurry he'll hold you down to less than that. Be honest for once and tell me what he's going to give." 22,000, Weems said sullenly. "I'll give you 25," said Trent carelessly. "His is a cash offer," Weems said, shaking his head, "and that's why I'm selling so cheap." Trent took a roll of bills from his pocket and peeled off before Weems' astounded eyes $25,000. "Mine is also a cash offer," he observed. "Come right off to my lawyer," Weems cried, springing to his feet. "Gee, and I thought you hadn't as much money as I have." Thus it was that Chapter 20. Wanted, an emerald. Since Anthony Trent had replaced the red glass in his Benares lamp with the Mount Aubyn ruby, the other pieces of cut glass seemed so dull by comparison that had his visitors been many, suspicion must have arisen from the very difference they exhibited. The lamp was discreetly swung in a distant corner and the button which lighted the lamp carefully concealed. Reading one morning that owing to the financial trouble into which the war had plunged a great West of England family, the celebrated Edgecombe sapphire had been purchased by a New York manufacturer of ammunition, one of the new millionaires created by the war to buy what other countries had to sacrifice. The papers gave every necessary particular. At 10 o'clock one morning Anthony Trent sallied forth to loot. By dinner time the Edgecombe sapphire had replaced a blue cube of cut glass in his lamp, and the papers were devoting front page space to its daring abduction. How he accomplished it properly belongs to another chapter in the life of the master criminal. So easy was it of consummation that he planned to use the same technique for a greater coup. When these two great stones were making his brazen lamp a thing of flashing beauty, they threw into infinite dullness the cube of green. Looking at it night after night when Mrs. Kinney was long abed and the grateful silences had drowned the noise of day, Anthony Trent longed for an emerald to bear these lordly jewels company. There was an excellent second-hand bookstore on 32nd Street between 7th Avenue and 6th, where he browsed often among waiting volumes. One day he picked up a book written in French, Romances of Precious Stones. It was by a Madame Cernin, grand-niece of the great Russian novelist Fyodor Vladimir-Larovich. Trent remembered that he had read her translation of Krasny Baba and Gospodi Pomi, and looked at this original work with interest. It was published in Paris just before the war. He knew well that most of the great stones which had become famous historically were still in Europe. And Europe, until the long war was over, was close to him. He hoped Madame Cernin had something to say about American-owned jewels. There was a reference in the index and later in his rooms he read it eagerly. There were, Madame Cernin announced, but two of the great emeralds in the United States. One belonged to the wife of the Colombian minister and was found in Colombia. Trent considered this stone carefully. It might not be in the United States after all. Madame Cernin was doubtful herself. But of the second stone she was certain. It was known as the Takowaja emerald. A century and a half before it had been dug from the Ural mountains. That great commenceuse, the second Catherine of Russia, had given it to her favorite, Gregory Orlov, who had sold it to a travelling English noble in a day before American gold was known in continental Europe. It was now the property of Andrew Apthorpe, of Boston in Massachusetts. Presumably the man was a collector, and assuredly he was wealthy, but Anthony Trent had never heard of him. A trip by boat to Boston would make a pleasant break, and a day later he was steaming north. His inevitable golf clubs accompanied him. Trent was one of those natural-born players whose game suffer little if short of practice, and of late he had not stinted himself of play. He told Mrs. Kinney he was going to Edgartown for a few days. He had sometimes played around these island links, and his bag of clubs was always an excellent excuse for travelling in strange parts. Directly he had registered at the Adams house, he consulted a city directory. Andrew Apthorpe's town house was in the same block on Beacon Street which held the Clent Bulstrode mansion. It was a vast, forbidding residence of red brick running back to the Charles Embankment. The windows were small and barred and the shades drawn. An empty milk bottle and a morning paper at a basement door gave evidence of occupancy, and at the garage at the rear a burly chauffeur was cleaning the brass work of a touring car. Looking wisely and suspiciously at Trent as he sauntered by was an Airedale. The family, Trent surmised, was absent, and the caretaker, who rose late if the neglected post was a sign, and this man and dog were left to guard the place. If the Takowaja emerald were housed here with two such guardians, its recovery might not be difficult. But the more Trent thought of it, the more improbable it seemed that the owner of such a gem should leave it prey to any organized attack. The curious part about this Ural emerald was that Trent had never before heard of it, and he knew American-owned stones well. Most of the owners of famous jewels were ready to talk of them, lend them for exhibition purposes when they were properly guarded, but he had never seen a line about the Apthorpe emerald. A few minutes before midday Anthony Trent strolled into the Ames building and saw that Andrew Apthorpe, cotton broker, occupied very large offices. A little later he followed one of the Apthorpe clerks, a well-dressed, good-looking young man, to the place where he lunched. It was curiously unlike a New York restaurant. Circular mahogany counters surrounded self-possessed young women who permitted themselves to attend to those who hungered. To such as they knew and liked they were affable. To others their front was cold and severe. The Apthorpe employee was a favorite, apt at retort and not ill-pleased if others noted it. Soon he drifted into conversation with Trent, who, with his careful mind, had read through the column devoted to cotton in the morning papers and was ready with a carefully remembered phrase or two for the stranger who responded in kind. Gradually, by way of the Red Sox, the beauties of Norumbega Park and the architectural qualities of Keith's, the young man lapsed into personalities and told Anthony Trent all he desired to know of Andrew Apthorpe. Andrew, it seemed, was not beloved of his employees. He was unappreciative of merit unless it accompanied female beauty. He was old. He was ill. His family had abandoned him with the sincere reluctance that wealth is ever abandoned. "He lives up at Groton," said Trent's loquacious informant, "in a sort of castle on a hill fitted with every burglar-resisting device that was ever invented." "What's he afraid of?" Trent demanded. "He's got a lot of valuables," the other answered. "Cut gems and cameos and intaglios and things that wouldn't interest anyone but an old miser like him. I have to go up there once in a while. The old boy has an automatic in his pocket all the while. I think he's crazy." There were 2 or 3 men at Camp Devon's whom Trent knew slightly. The camp was within walking distance of Groton, he learned. By 9:30 on the following morning Anthony Trent left Ayr behind him and breasted the rising ground towards Groton. He could go to the camp later. He might not go at all, but if questioned as to his presence the excuse would be a just one. He was always anxious that his motives would pass muster with the police if ever he came in contact with them. After a couple of miles he came in sight of the beautiful tower of Groton School Chapel. 2 or 3 times he had played for his school against this famous institution in the years that seemed now so far behind him. The town of Groton, some distance from the more modern school, charmed his senses. Restful houses among immemorial elms, well-kept gardens and a general air of contentment made the town one to be remembered, even in New England. He hoped he would be able to find something about Apthorpe from some local historian, without having to lead openly to the matter. A luncheon at the famous inn might discover some such informant. But he was not destined to enter that admirable hostelry, for coming toward him, with dignified carriage and an aura of fragrant Havana smoke about him, was Mr. Westward, whom he had known slightly at Kennebago. This Mr. Westward was the most widely known fisherman on the famous lake, an authority wherever red fly men foregathered. Trent would have preferred to meet none who knew him by name. This was a professional adventure and not a trout fishing vacation. But the angler had already recognized him and there was no help for it. Westward rather liked Anthony Trent, as he liked all men who were skilled in the use of the wet fly and were, in his own published words, high-minded fly-fishing sportsmen. "Why, my dear fellow," said Westward genially, "what are you doing in my home town?" "I'd no idea you lived here," Trent said, shaking his hand. "I thought you were a New Yorker." Westward pointed to a modest house. "This is what I call my office," he explained. "I do my writing there and house my fishing tackle and my specimens." "I wish you'd let me see them," Trent suggested, smiling. "I've often marveled at the way you catch 'em." It was past 12 when he had finished talking over what Mr. Westward had to show. He realized he had forgotten the matter which brought him to Groton. When Mr. Westward asked him to luncheon he hesitated a moment. This hesitation was born not of a disinclination to accept the angler's hospitality, but rather to the feeling that he was out for business, and if he failed at it might be led as a criminal to whatever jail was handy. And were he thus a prisoner it would embarrass a good sportsman. But Mr. Westward gained his point and led Trent to a big rambling house further down the street that was a rich storehouse of the old and quaint furniture of colonial days. Mrs. Westward proved to be a woman of charm and culture, endowed with a quick wit and the gift of entertaining comment on what local happenings were out of the ordinary. "Has Charles told you of the murder?" she asked. "We've been talking fish," Anthony Trent explained. "Oh, you fishermen," she laughed. "I often tell my husband he won't take any notice of the last trump if he's fishing or talking of trout. We actually had a murder here last night." "I hope it was someone who could be easily spared," Trent returned, "and not a friend." "I could spare him," Mrs. Westward said decisively. "I know his wife and she has my friendship, but for Andrew Apthorpe I have never cared." "Apthorpe?" Trent cried. "The cotton man?" "The same," Mrs. Westward assured him. Anthony Trent was suddenly all attention. He surmised that the murder of so rich a man was actuated by a desire for his collection, and if so, where was the Takowaja emerald? "Please tell me," he entreated. "Murders fascinate me. If the penalty were not so severe I should engage in murder constantly. What was it? Revenge? Robbery?" "Yes and no," Charles Westward observed with that judicial air which confounded questioners. "Revenge, no doubt. Robbery perhaps, but we are awaiting the arrival of Mrs. Apthorpe and her daughter. We shall not know until then whether his collection of valuables has been stolen." "What about the revenge theory?" Trent inquired. "Apthorpe made many enemies as a younger man. Physically he was violent. There are no doubt many who detested him. Personally I had no quarrel with him. I sent him a mess of trout from the Unkety Brook this season
and had a little talk with him over the phone, but he saw few except his lawyer and business associates." "Is anyone suspected in particular?" Trent asked. "The whole thing is mysterious," Mrs. Westward declared with animation. "Last night at 8 o'clock I received a telephone message from his nurse, a Miss Thompson, a woman I hardly know. Once or twice I've seen her at the Red Cross meetings, but that is all. She apologized for calling but said she felt nervous. It seems that Mr. Apthorpe had let all the servants go off to the band concert at Ayer. There were 2 automobiles filled with them. The only people left were Miss Thompson in the house and a gardener who lives in a cottage on the grounds. They left the house just after dinner, say 7:30. At 7:45 a stranger called to see Mr. Apthorpe." "Accurately timed," commented Mr. Westward. "Miss Thompson declined to admit him. You must understand, Mr. Trent, that Andrew Apthorpe was a very sick man, heart trouble mainly, and she was within her rights. The man who would not give his name put his foot in the door and said he would see Mr. Apthorpe if he waited there all night. While she was arguing with him, begging him in fact to go away, her employer came to the head of the stairs that led from the main rooms to the hall. Miss Thompson explained what had happened. To her surprise he said, 'I've been expecting him for 20 years. Let him in.'" "Why should she call you up?" Trent asked. "Merely because she was nervous and knew other people even less than she did me." Mrs. Westward hesitated a moment. "There have been rumors about her and Mr. Apthorpe which were not pleasant. They were probably not true, but when a man has lived as he had, it was not surprising. She called me up at 8 because the 2 men were quarreling. My husband told you he was a man of violent temper. That is putting it mildly. I told her there was nothing to be alarmed about. At 9 she called me up again to say that she would be grateful if Mr. Westward and my nephew Richmond, who is staying with me, would go up there, as she had heard blows struck, and Mr. Apthorpe was too ill to engage in any sort of tussle. I told her my 2 men were out, but that the police should be called in. While I was talking she gave a shriek. It was a most dramatic moment, and I could hear her steps running from the telephone." "My nephew and I came in at that moment," Westward interrupted, "and went up the hill to the house as fast as possible. Mrs. Westward meanwhile had telephoned for the police. Miss Thompson was waiting on the steps. She was hysterical and afraid to go back into the lonely house." "Richmond said he thought she'd been drinking," his wife interjected. "That meant nothing," Westward observed. "She was hysterical, and I don't wonder in that great lonely house. When we went in with the police we found the big living room door locked with the key on the inside. We had to break it open and found it bolted. Evidently the stranger had seen to that. Old Apthorpe was lying dead, shot through the head with a bullet from his own revolver. The window was open. There was a 12-foot drop to the grass outside and the man had lowered himself by a portiere. So far not a trace has been found of him. A great many people pass through here on the way to or from Boston, and we've become so used to strangers that no heed is paid to them any more." "Was there any evidence of robbery?" Trent asked. "Not a trace so far as we could see. I mean by that there was no disorder. Things of value might have been taken, but nothing had been broken open. We shan't know until Mrs. Apthorpe comes." "It was evidently," Mr. Westward declared, "some man whom he had been expecting. Miss Thompson, according to her story, did not know the man's name and yet was told to admit him. It may be the police will find it from correspondence." "I doubt it," Trent observed, shaking his head. "If it was a man Apthorpe had dreaded for a score of years he wouldn't be corresponding with him." "Then why was he admitted?" asked Mrs. Westward. "Consider the circumstances," Anthony Trent reminded her. He was becoming thoroughly interested. Here he was, almost in the house, his foot in the door. All the servants were away. No matter what Apthorpe said he would have got in. What more likely than that the proud, overbearing old man felt sufficient confidence in his nerve and his revolver? Or if he didn't, he would not admit it. The curious part, to my mind, was how this unknown timed it so exactly. He turned up just as the servants were going out for the evening. He turned to Mrs. Westward. "Why didn't Miss Thompson telephone for police aid, do you suppose? Does it seem strange to you that she telephoned to you instead?" "Knowing Andrew Apthorpe it does not," she answered. "He would have been furious if she had done so. To begin with, he has had many squabbles with the local authorities over trumpery matters. He was most unpopular. The last thing he would have desired would be to have them in his house.